Brad Keselowski was sitting one row ahead of Kyle Busch on a plane to Dover last week. Busch sat down, fell asleep almost immediately, and Keselowski noticed something was off, but did not think much of it. That was the last time he saw him outside of a race car. Days later, Kyle Busch was gone. And now Keselowski is sitting with something that no rivalry prepares you for. The moment you realize the closure you always assumed was coming is never going to arrive. Brad Keselowski spoke publicly about Kyle Busch 4 days after his death, sharing details of their final encounter and reflecting on one of the defining rivalries of his NASCAR career. The two men shared a flight to Dover the week before Busch died, the same weekend Busch won what turned out to be his final race. Keselowski noticed Busch seemed unwell on the plane, quieter than usual, falling asleep quickly. He did not flag it as anything serious at the time. They saw each other on the track at Dover. That was it. Keselowski described a rivalry in which beating Busch mattered more than almost any other result on the racetrack, where finishing behind Busch on a strong day felt worse than it should, and finishing ahead of him on a weak day felt better than the number deserved. He said he had imagined more than once what the reconciliation would look like when both of them were retired and in the Hall of Fame. He thought it would happen eventually. It will not. The Keselowski-Busch rivalry was one of the most sustained and genuinely hostile competitive relationships NASCAR produced in the past 2 decades. This was not manufactured tension for broadcast. These were two elite drivers who were frequently in the same space on the track who had real on-track incidents, real grievances, and a mutual intensity that made every shared moment on the racetrack feel like something more than a race. Keselowski is a Cup Series champion himself. He won it in 2012. He has 38 career Cup wins. He was one of the few active drivers who competed against Busch at the highest level for long enough to understand exactly what it meant to race against him at his best. His perspective on the rivalry carries the weight of someone who was actually inside it, not observing from the outside. What makes Keselowski's account of the plane ride so affecting is its accidental quality. He was not there for any significant reason. It was a coincidence of travel logistics. Busch sat nearby, seemed off, fell asleep. Nothing about that sequence suggested it would become the last real memory Keselowski carries of his longtime rival outside of competition. The detail that Busch seemed unwell is going to sit with Keselowski in a particular way that only makes sense if you understand how suddenly and how fast the illness progressed. Busch won a race at Dover that same weekend. He was training in Charlotte the following Wednesday when he collapsed. The window between appearing merely tired on a plane and dying from sepsis was less than a week. Nobody who saw him that week, not Keselowski, not anyone, had any reason to prepare for what was coming. That absence of warning is part of what makes the loss feel so unprocessable for the people around him. There was no goodbye because there was no signal that one was needed. Keselowski said something in this interview that is going to stay with people for a long time, that a 5th place finish on a day when Busch finished 4th did not feel like a good day, and that a 10th place finish on a day when he beat Busch felt better than a 10th deserved to feel. That is a precise and honest description of what a real rivalry does to a competitor's psychology. It reorders the value system. It makes your relationship to one specific opponent more meaningful than the raw result on the scoreboard. Most drivers will tell you that their focus is entirely on their own race, on their own championship picture, on the points that matter regardless of who else is nearby. Keselowski is admitting that was never entirely true when Busch was involved. Busch was the measuring stick. Beating him recalibrated everything else. That kind of psychological investment in a rival is rare and expensive. It demands enormous competitive energy. The constant tracking of where the other person is, what they are doing, whether you are ahead or behind. For that to be a feature of your professional life for nearly 2 decades and then have it end not with a reconciliation but with a funeral is a specific kind of disorientation that does not have a clean name. Keselowski's description of the Hall of Fame vision, the ceremony, the laugh, the buried hatchet, is the most revealing moment of the entire interview, because it shows that the rivalry was always understood on some level as temporary, as something that would eventually complete itself through the natural arc of 2 careers winding down, 2 men aging out of the competitive fire, 2 former enemies finding common ground and shared history. That arc existed in Keselowski's imagination as a future event, something to look forward to, even while the rivalry itself was still hard. What he is processing now is the removal of that future. The closure was always going to be the retirement moment. That moment will never come. And Keselowski, to his credit, immediately acknowledged that this loss is much larger than how it affects him personally. That the grief belongs primarily to Busch's family, not to his rivals. That self-awareness, stated explicitly and unprompted, matters. The line about standing on opposite ends of the room in shared settings and how unpleasant that felt in the moment. And how much better it seems compared to the reality of now is one of the most quietly devastating observations anyone has made this entire week about what it means to lose someone you are in conflict with. You do not appreciate the proximity until it is gone. Even the tension was a form of connection, and now there is neither. Keselowski's interview has been received as one of the more honest and searching pieces of public reflection to come out of this entire Charlotte weekend, and the competition for that distinction has been significant. What separates it from other tributes is its willingness to sit with complexity. Keselowski did not sanitize the rivalry into something warmer than it was. He described it accurately: cold in shared spaces, competitive to the point of recalibrating his sense of results, never fully resolved. And then he said how much he is going to miss it. That combination of honesty and grief is harder to produce than a standard tribute, and it lands accordingly. The plain detail has generated the most response. The image of Keselowski sitting one row ahead of Busch, noticing something was wrong, filing it away as nothing significant, and never seeing him alive outside of a race car again. That is the kind of detail that makes loss feel concrete and specific rather than abstract. People are responding to it because it reflects a universally human experience. The last time you saw someone, and the fact that you had no idea it was the last time. NASCAR fans who followed the rivalry closely have received this as a fitting final chapter. Two drivers who competed at the highest level for decades, who never quite made peace while both were racing, and who are now permanently separated by the one outcome no rivalry anticipates. Keselowski channeled this loss into something productive, becoming one of the more articulate and consistent voices in the sport's ongoing effort to honor Busch's legacy honestly rather than sentimentally. His unique position as a genuine rival who competed at the same level for the same period of time gives him a credibility on the subject that few others have. He pushes for the Hall of Fame induction that Busch deserves, perhaps even advocates for it publicly, and finds in the process some version of the reconciliation he imagined, not with Busch directly, but with the history they shared and the sport that held them both. The absence of closure becomes a weight that Keselowski carries visibly through the rest of his career. The rivalry was always a motivating force. Busch was the benchmark, the standard, the specific opponent that made finishing positions mean more than they should. Losing that benchmark without resolution leaves a competitive void that reshapes how Keselowski approaches the remainder of his time in the sport, not catastrophically, but quietly. The rivalry was a feature of his professional identity for nearly 20 years. What replaces it is an open question, with no obvious answer. Brad Keselowski sat one row ahead of Kyle Busch on a plane to Dover, watched him fall asleep and thought nothing of it, and then watched him win a race that weekend and thought even less of it. He assumed the next chapter was still coming. The retirement, the ceremony, the laugh, the buried hatchet. Two rivals growing old enough to find it funny. That chapter does not get written now. And Keselowski, more than almost anyone who's spoken this week, seems to understand exactly what that means, not just for himself, but for what a great rivalry actually is. It is not just competition, it is a relationship. And you do not get to choose when it ends. Here's what I want from you in the comments of all the tributes and reflections that came out of this Charlotte weekend, the ceremony, the flowers, the victory lane speech, the bowway, all of it. Which one hit you the hardest and why? Because this one landed differently for me. Tell me where you landed. Subscribe if you have been here for the full arc of this story. 11 scripts across one.